Good morning, everyone. I'm sorry that I can't be with you, but as I think has probably been explained to you, we as a family are in COVID isolation. First of all, actually starting because Sam had symptoms, who gone to FCC school, so we've been off for his. And then actually on Thursday afternoon, we had a letter home from King Alfred's where Dan's whole year, because of positive tests, are now in self-isolation. So his self-isolation starts again from Thursday for 2 weeks, and I think this up and down scenario is where we're going to be for the next couple of months. But if it keeps people safe, that's the key thing. I wanted to share some reflections this morning from Philippians 1 verses 21 to the end, and I'm titling it Rejoicing in the Joys and Challenges of Following Christ. That's the title I've given to this sermon, which seems fitting not just because of the context in which Paul is writing to that church in Philippi, but also for us in the midst of this COVID pandemic. The Apostle Paul is writing from prison in Rome to the Christians in Philippi. Paul had faced many challenges in Philippi himself: imprisonment there, an earthquake there, but he'd also developed a very good relationship with the church. He had a soft spot for this church, so he is open about his own suffering, his own hopes, his own fears. He wrote to the church in Greek, and sometimes in translation to our English, some meaning can get lost in translation when it comes to key words. And in Philippians 1 verse 23, Paul talks of his desire to depart and says that he is torn about it. In the New Living Translation, it says he is torn between two desires. He says, I long to go and be with Christ, which would be better for me, but for your sakes, he says, it is better that I continue to live. That depart, or to go in Greek, is a simple word, analuia, A-N-A-L-U-A, analuia, which means to pull up the anchor or to dismantle the campsite. To pull up the anchor or to dismantle the campsite. In other words, to set off again on another journey. Paul was referring, of course, to his death, to die, to depart, to leave. But until his death, he was going to make the most of the life that God had given him, with its joys, yes, but also its challenges, even in prison. You know, it's easy for us just to move on swiftly over this passage because we know Paul to be a super Christian, a leader. So no wonder he has very deep struggles on these issues. He says in verse 21, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. But let's just pause for a moment before reflecting on the ups and downs of the Christian life. Paul has a very real struggle about this. He's in prison. He knows that at any time, night or day, the jailer could come, he could be taken out, beaten to death, to die, to be killed. Many people I talk to as a vicar these days are very anxious about catching COVID-19, even Christians. But St. Paul, I wonder what he would make of COVID-19 and the response of today's church, of Christians towards it. Certainly he would expect us to work with and support those put in authority over us, and for us to take precautions, not to act recklessly, not to pass on the virus through not being responsible. So yes, he'd encourage us to act on the good advice of the government and the scientific advisors, I'm sure. But I wonder, genuinely, I wonder, like the Apostle Paul, if our view of death, whenever that is, and whatever age and by whatever medical condition or virus or by other means that is If our view, like St. Paul's, is to me to live is Christ, everything about my daily living, everything about my hopes, my dreams, my desires, my priorities, everything that I do, to me to live is Christ, therefore to die, well, it is to gain. After death, I'll be in the presence of the one that I love, the one I serve for all eternity. So why should I fear death? I think there are two lessons that Paul gives to us from this brief passage. The first lesson Paul gives us about how we can rejoice in both the joys and the challenges of following Christ is to put all we go through, even COVID-19, through the eternal perspective. You and I are simply passing through this very brief period, maybe 80, 85 years or so on earth. No, it's not accidental. God does have a plan and purpose for you in it, and for what we do here, how we use this time wisely with and for Him. But it's 80, 85, 90 or so years out of eternity with God and all others who follow His Son Jesus Christ. So whatever your dilemmas, it may not be as acute as St. Paul's being in prison, but whatever your own imprisonment is, your own trial in life, your own anxiety, worry, problem may be this morning, firstly, Paul teaches us to put it in heaven and eternity's perspective, just like Paul did. The second lesson we learn from Paul, I believe, is in that Greek word, analeu. That word which means to pull up the anchor, to move on. In recent months, all across the south coast of England, you may have seen on the news, you will find tourist boat trips which can take you from the harbour out into the English Channel, and you will come up close right underneath those massive cruise ships which have been anchored offshore now that they're redundant due to COVID-19. They are anchored offshore because it's cheaper than a commercial berth in Plymouth, Portsmouth or Southampton Harbour. They are simply anchored offshore. Now the English Channel is not like the Atlantic, where ships, even large ships like cruise ones, can be tossed around like a corkscrew under fast running water. Nonetheless, those cruise ships, they need to anchor or they will drift off. St. Paul's life had a purpose, it had a focus, a meaning and a centrality to it. Why? Because Jesus Christ was at the centre of Paul's life, and Paul was anchored to the rock which provided the solid, steadfast, faithful assurance that Paul needed despite all he faced in life. Paul's life was no bed of roses. We read of beatings, stonings,